Welcome everyone to the second session of the Culturally Responsive Mathematics Assessment Workshop, organized by Dr. Cynthia, Dr. Joanne, Janice, and also Dr. Layton. And now I'm going to pass this off to Janice.
No, that would be Joanne.
My apologies.
That's okay.
Is Joanne here? I don't see her picture. Did she get dropped? She was just here.
No, she's here.
Okay.
She says unmute.
There we go. Thanks. I'm so excited to get going here. Welcome, everyone. We are really excited to share with you some ideas about culturally responsive math assessment and hear your ideas, perspectives, and questions. So let's go to the next slide, please, Cynthia. Great. Quam huiam tesquich, Joanne Archibald. I'm known as my Indigenous name, Quam huiam. I am also known as Joanne Archibald. I am a member of Stalo Nation and have ancestry in Statlium Catholic community as well. And I am very pleased to facilitate this session with my colleagues, Dr. Cynthia Nicol and Dr. Janice. And I will start with the acknowledgement of the Musqueam unceded lands. And today I am located on the Musqueam traditional unceded lands. And also I'm located on the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh lands, but I wanted to acknowledge the Musqueam people today because UBC, the University of British Columbia, is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Musqueam people. And I wanted to acknowledge the Musqueam community's website for educators who are in the Vancouver area. This is a wonderful resource to learn about the Musqueam, the people of the river grass, and they have developed videos and educational resources about their community. And you see on this slide, there is a Musqueam teaching kit, and they have wonderful resources. One in particular is an interactive map of Musqueam places in the Vancouver area that have the Musqueam, the Hunkaminam name, and the meaning of the particular place. And I think it's important that we learn more about the Indigenous people on whose land we are situated. And many communities have their various websites. So we'll go. And I want to acknowledge the supporters or sponsors of this webinar series. They are all noted here on this slide. In particular, we have the Indigenous Math Network. We will have all these webinars posted on that network as the website, as well as the Edith Lando website. And we also have sponsorship of the David Robitaille International STEM Education Network. And we also have a community partner, Dogwood 25, a not-for-profit community organization supporting mentorship of K-12 teachers in culturally responsive approaches. And we also have sponsorship from the BC Ministry of Education and the Rural Education Advisory. Our other partner, Dr. Leighton Schnellert, is the Eleanor Ricks Professorship of Rural Education. We also have another partner in our work, and this is the Mouse Woman, the Haida Mouse Woman, or Kuganjad. And Billy Yovanovich, the Haida artist, gifted us with this beautiful image of Mouse Woman. And Mouse Woman is always around, always willing to help. And we like to think of math and culture that way, that they're all around us and they're always willing to help us think, be, and understand our worlds. We are excited to develop this particular webinar series about culturally responsive math assessment. And this is our second one, as you can see on the slide. Our first one, November 2nd, which I'll go into a short summary, and then we have one more in February there. But when we had our session in November, and for those who were not present, you have an opportunity to listen and look at the recording. The link is in the chat. And we used that session to introduce a number of topics. We certainly talked about the context and landscape of math assessment in British Columbia, where numeracy is one of the two pillars of the redesigned curriculum. And we also have the landscape of indigeneity, where Indigenous perspectives are now a part of the K-12 curriculum throughout the grades, throughout the subject areas. And along with Indigenous perspectives and worldviews, we also have the First Peoples Principles of Learning, which have been guiding the development of teaching for a number of years now. And of course, we're guided by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, along with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and with matters concerning equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So it really is an exciting landscape in the K-12 BC learning context. And we also introduced the notion of Indigenous Storywork, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few moments. And we highlighted some considerations about the general area of culturally responsive teaching, and then a bit more focus on Indigenous pedagogies, where we also shared with participants various teachers' experiences in BC, where they have developed Indigenous culturally responsive approaches to teaching mathematics in K-12. We also asked all of the participants joining us about certain questions in relation to math and culturally responsive math. And then we suggested that those who would feel excited about what we had talked about, to create an opportunity to experience one of the Indigenous Storywork principles. That first session, we focused on reverence and reciprocity. I'm going to do a short highlight of the Indigenous Storywork principles. And these are principles that I learned from various Indigenous elders and storytellers for a number of years. And there is a website, indigenousstorywork.com, that you can access various videos where I talk more in detail about the 7 principles that you see on the slide here. The 4 principles: reverence, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. You know, I often think of these as helping us get ready to engage with Indigenous stories, to learn from and with the Indigenous stories and the storytellers and the communities associated with these stories. And the other 3 principles of holism, interrelatedness, and synergy may help us work with the stories as we make meaning, to try and get a sense of how the traditional and life experience stories help us think, help us maybe deal with our emotions, help us think about our actions, the physical, and also to think about our spiritual nature, and figuring out how all of these might relate to one another. And we focused on, as I mentioned, reverence and then reciprocity. But with reverence, you know, it's one way to become open, to try and experience the wonder and the awe of how students learn, what they learn, to think about learning from nature, learning from our experiences. And if we open ourselves to experiencing wonder, you know, it's like magic in a way. And, you know, part of this is helping us honor the knowledges that the students bring to the school setting. So we can ask ourselves, in which ways can I honor students' ways of knowing and being? And part of this might mean we have to be curious. We may have to put aside some things we've thought about to be open to other ways of thinking, doing, and being that relate to mathematics. And as we do this, we then have, well, it is a responsibility, but it's a way that we can then share our learning with others so that it can deepen or it can extend what we are learning or what we have learned. And that sometimes we can be both a teacher and a student can be both a teacher and a student. And also that we can learn from more than humans, especially nature, elements of nature or resources of nature, and that they can teach us important things. And we have to think about how might we share these understandings with other educators, or our understandings of community, place, and culture, and think about how these might guide math assessment. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Joanne. So just following Joanne's introduction and summary.
Sorry, I
of
forgot
what
to press
we had-
accept.
For just a summary of our session, our first session, we discussed a little bit around culturally responsive math teaching being responsive. And just to highlight, we were talking about it in terms of students' cultural communities, in terms of their identities, in terms of the local issues that they might be experiencing experiencing alongside the global issues, and then thinking about how education contributes to family and community. And then we also talked a little bit about how, the nature of Indigenous pedagogies and perspectives and practices, and what tends to be emphasized in these practices in terms of interrelatedness and relationality and being a dynamic ecosystem. We're thinking about the human and the other than human as kin and relationship in that way. The idea of intergenerational learning, that learning extends beyond just ourselves and goes intergenerationally. Thinking about collaboration and collective learning, students' gifts and strengths that they bring, the importance of land and language, and also stories. And Joanne mentioned much of that in our summary of our session 1, and in terms of thinking about reciprocity and reverence, Storywork principles. So we asked you in our Padlet, and I think the Padlet link will be in the chat, but here is a QR code if you want to use that, or you can use the Padlet link to get you to the Padlet. But we had asked you from our November session to this session, for those of you who are able, and don't worry if you weren't able, is to think about a story or an action or something that you're trying out that might have us sort of think more about these principles of reverence and reciprocity. And some of you were able to post something to the Padlet, and I'm just going to share a couple highlights from that, because I think they're quite good, and I think it'll help us think about what we're going to attend to in session 2. But in terms of reverence is a difficult, a challenging principle for me, but I think it's very nicely captured in a couple of the posts, where one post says that reverence is demonstrating excitement, and that when students have had, especially when students have had a history of having their work go unnoticed or unacknowledged. And another post talks about thinking about reverence in terms of really noticing and appreciating how much the students already know. So if we can only do that, if we pause and listen for and make time for thinking about how do I learn what my students already know, and how do I help my students whose work maybe is going unacknowledged, lifting that up so that it becomes something that we can use as a class. In terms of reciprocity, thinking about this post was looking at nature and how nature provides us with all the tools that we need. This is beautifully said. All the tools and materials that we need in order to learn and be together on the land. And in terms of learning from students, this reciprocity of giving, it's not just always a one way, teacher convening information and knowledge to students, but what do we learn from our students? What do we learn from the land? What can we learn from families and communities? But in this post, a person was talking about students actually teaching the lessons, and that in doing so, the students learned that they could also be encouraged to share their work spontaneously. So it was by making room for students to share, others in the class took up that opportunity and that challenge as well. So for those of you who were at our session in November, or for those of you just joining us new this time, if you have a story or something you'd like to share related to thinking about reciprocity or reverence, we invite you to unmute and just maybe share if you feel up to that, or putting something in the chat. And I don't see my chat, so someone else will be able to read that for us, or tell me what it is. Oh no, I found my chat. Okay, good. I'm good. So would anybody have anything they'd like to share that they didn't have a chance to post to the Padlet, or just something that sparks your interest or your curiosity, or a question you might have thinking about reciprocity and reverence in our teaching? Or if it's okay if you don't want to share now, you can also post to the Padlet a little bit later. Specifically in math asks, yeah, think about, oh, if you can think of something outside math, that would be okay too. And then we could think together about what would that look like in math? Is it even possible to think about it in math? So yeah, do you have something, Macy? I'm putting you on the spot.
Hi. Yeah, I was just thinking about some time outside with my students, and how I often find that a moment of reverence where I see them cooperating and taking leadership and organizing each other and we did a lot of work on kind of like this idea of almost like sportsmanship and being honorable with each other in a sporting context. And now I'm thinking about how to integrate it further into like the math classroom.
That's
But
interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, that, and I just really enjoy those moments where I can take a step back and I see that they're working together well and being teachers and learners for each other.
Beautifully said. I love that, being teachers and learners for each other, so that they can see that a teacher is more than just us sitting in the front of the classroom, that we can see land as a teacher, which is what the focus of this session will be shortly. Yeah, thank you, Macy, for sharing that. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to share to add to that? I like Macy thinking about how this might happen in other areas, like in sports or other subject areas, and then to think, critically about, what is it then, what makes it more challenging to do this in a math context? Why am I finding it different in this context versus that context? So that might be an interesting question you might have for yourself that you could experiment with between now and when we meet again in February. And Jancy, sorry, Jancy, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. A wonderful moment was while I was teaching today, when I was quiet. Today was when a quiet student agreed to take the marker and show how he understands a concept on the whiteboard. Yeah, beautiful. He was all smiles afterwards. Great confidence booster. Yeah, when they can just step up and take that on and they feel comfortable doing that. Yeah, so you set up the right conditions for that. Thank you for sharing that.
And Cynthia, someone shared a video in the Padlet under reverence just recently. I don't know if it was today or just in the last couple of days, but a short video of a student explaining their strategy for multiplying fractions. And, to be able to step back and say, wow, that's pretty amazing, because it maybe hasn't been a way that you've thought about it before, or that another student has never shared that particular strategy. So, creating those opportunities to be amazed and in awe of our students is part of that reverence piece.
Yeah, thank you, Janice. Yeah, it's really easy to say, oh, your way is way different from mine. Do it my way, because I understand my way. So it's really easy to step in that sense. And if we are open up to our students and what they can share with us, we can be learners as well. Okay, so there's more opportunities for sharing in that Padlet. So please take that opportunity to share it to the community of culturally assessment math people that we're developing here. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to then kind of help us think about how we can look to land or earth or place as teacher, in terms of thinking about asking questions around how can our assessment practices nurture trusting relationships, or how can we value collaboration as well as individual success, and how can we contribute to family and community thriving, as well as create conditions for life continuing. And I think looking to land will help us think more about these questions. And some of these questions kind of come from our thinking about learning from land. And a good place to start with some of this is with Dr. Suzanne Simard of UBC, and she's in the Faculty of Forestry. And you might be aware of some of her work, which has received kind of increased attention lately, especially in a series called Ted Lasso, where her work is actually referenced. But in her research, which began a while ago in the early 1990s. She actually did some work with paper, birch, aspen, and Douglas fir, and noticed that they actually communicate through their fungal networks. And her, like the roots down below, her research actually really challenged a very particular colonial perspective that trees were seen as competing with one another for light and nutrients, and that the tallest trees were those that took or harnessed the most nutrients or resources, and that they were the best competitors. And because of that, they became the strongest and the most resilient. But with her work, with Dr. Samar's work, she found that trees like birch and aspen and Douglas communicated through these networks, and that they even shared resources, and that they seemed to even sense their own kin. They could determine whether or not there was a seedling nearby that was like themselves, and provide extra boosts or blasts of nutrients to their own little seedlings. And they would do that through the fungal network when it was needed. So they were doing anything else but competing. They're actually very much collaborating. And it's really nice work. If you're interested in sort of reading more about this, here are a couple more resources for further reading in this area. The book here on the left, Can You Hear the Trees Talking, is actually for young adults, young students. So you might find something in there that you can share with your students. And then I want to just also mention thinking about mosses, because mosses are another way of going to a place where we can think about land and earth as teacher. And mosses live on many different places all over the world, and rocks and trees and roofs and fences and little tiny cracks. And they're very, 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 very old. And in her books, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's from the Bear Clan, she's Potawatomi, and she describes how in her books how important mosses are, and how water is actually moved through the mosses, not by like pipes and channels and pumps and stuff, by roots, but simply by the shape of the plant itself, and how water isn't just stored by one little piece of the moss itself. And it's really hard to pick out a little piece of it. That's why I chose this image here. But the water is actually stored in collaboration with everybody there. So they actually kind of form a colony, and it's working together for this shared wealth where everybody benefits. So Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about it in human terms, in terms of it like it's not about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, as we tend to think about in human society, but instead how everybody shares the wealth, and by doing that, everybody benefits. So just thinking about mosses again, they grow very slowly. They even take a break or pause for a bit when the conditions are severe, and then they kind of grow again when there's more water and nutrients around them. And they make very few demands on their surroundings. So thinking about, what does this mean then for culturally responsive math assessment, and what kinds of lessons could we learn from this really quick survey of thinking about the earth through trees communicating through their fungal networks, and mosses in terms of taking the resources and pulling them together so that everybody benefits. We can come back to these questions I started with, was thinking about how can assessment value collaboration as well as individual success? How can our assessment practices contribute to family and community thriving? So it isn't about some people getting more and others getting less, and that divide being increasing. How can our assessment nurture trusting relationships, which is quite different from how many of our assessment practices, which tend to rank and sort and mark and scar students for long periods of time? How can we instead nurture trusting relationships? And then also, how can we create life-friendly conditions, conditions that benefit everybody, so everybody can grow? So some ways of thinking about how the land can teach us other ways to be as a teacher in our classrooms, especially thinking about math assessment. So let's think about this now in terms of the next two principles of Indigenous Storywork. And Joanne will now take us through respect and responsibility. Joanne.
Well, I'll first talk very briefly about each of the these two principles, but then I'll tell a story that might help us think more about these principles in relationship to culturally responsive math assessment. So, you know, with respect, it also could be a way that we demonstrate respect as we use all our senses for learning and for teaching, to listen, to observe, to experience, to feel. And along with that, often requires patience, you know, to be able to observe for a while, or to really listen to what someone is saying, and to think about the experiences and what can we draw from our experiential learning activities. And there are some questions that might help us think more about understanding and practicing respect, especially if we think about expanding and using all of our senses, or getting our whole selves involved, and thinking of how we respond to students thinking in that way. Next one, please. And yeah, and with responsibility, then part of this might be in relation to indigeneity, is understanding how colonization has shaped my perspectives, or an educator's perspectives about Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And in order to really critically understand how colonization has shaped all of us, you know, we could develop learning relationships with Indigenous educators, or the family members or community members of Indigenous students. So that way we can get to know the students more, get to know what has shaped, you know, their perspectives, or how they feel about learning, how they feel about school, how they feel about math. And so right now I'll tell this story that has guided my thinking in many different ways, that I heard from Dr. Eber Hampton of the Chickasaw people. And Dr. Hampton, you know, has been an educator in the US and in Canada for many years. And one time he told this story, and I was able to get his permission to retell the story and to shape the trickster to one that I'm familiar with. And so I used the trickster character of Coyote, or Old Man Coyote in particular. And this is a story about Old Man Coyote searching for the bone needle. So just relax and kind of have a bit of fun thinking and imagining this story. One day, Old Man Coyote decided that it was time for him to go out hunting, and his food supplies were getting low. So he grabbed his bag with all his tools in it, and off he went. And we could think maybe he was going in those beautiful forests that Cynthia showed us those slides of, and you know, experiencing the awe and wonder of those marvelous trees and the moss. And Coyote, he could get distracted when he's thinking about all those things, but he continued on that day, and he wasn't lucky. He was hoping he might find a deer, but he didn't. And so it was getting late in the afternoon. So Old Man Coyote found a nice little clearing and started a little fire and sat by the fire. And it was getting dark about this time, and his feet were quite sore from all that walking. And so he looked in his bag for his moccasins to make him feel much better. So he put the moccasins on and noticed that there was a hole in the toe of one of the moccasins. And so he decided to sew it. And by now it's nice and dark, and the fire is giving off really good light, and he's warm and cozy. And Old Man Coyote can't find that bone needle in his bag. So then he starts to get on his hands and knees, and he crawls around the fire a few times. And as he's doing that, he hears the voice of the owl say, "Oh man, Coyote, I've been watching you crawl around that fire a number of times. What are you looking for?" And he tells Owl he's searching for the bone needle to sew up his moccasin. And she said, "I'll give you a hand." So she makes a swoop around the campfire and tells Old Man Coyote that it's not there. And she says, "Where were you when you last used that bone needle?" And he thinks and he remembers that he was in the northern direction. And that's where he used it last. And she says to him, "Well, Old Man Coyote, you know it's not around this campfire, but I wonder, why have you kept going around and around this fire when you know that the bone needle isn't there?" And Coyote says, "Well, he says this fire gives off such good light and it's easy to search for the bone needle around this fire." So that was Eber's story, about Old Man Coyote searching for that bone needle. And sometimes our stories may stop rather abruptly and we wonder, well, is that the real end of the story? But what I've learned is that when the story stops, it's an invitation for those who are listening to become involved in the story. And as I, have thought about that story in relation to culturally responsive math assessment, and what we might learn from nature, I thought that that bone needle is made, often from the bone of a deer. Where I'm from, the Stala, we use bone needles. We call them an awl to help us with our basket making and other things. And so, we could appreciate that we use the resources, from the four-leggeds to help us survive and sustain us. And, I thought that Old Man Coyote didn't value, that bone needle for how it could help him in his daily life. And sometimes I thought the bone needle could also symbolize Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And sometimes we may not appreciate the value, the power, the beauty of this type of knowledge, or we may not know how to care for it, or to ensure that we have proper protocols that we might follow for the guidelines on how we learn and share particular Indigenous ways of knowing and being, especially through Indigenous stories. So maybe Coyote needs to learn a little bit more about how to take care of that bone needle, how to be responsible for it. And I think that Owl, as a friend, is there to help Old Man Coyote. And I was starting to think about, well, how could that owl demonstrate some respect towards Coyote, who, clearly needs a bit of help there. And that, so I've had a bit of fun thinking about that lately. And, that perhaps that owl could think about how she could guide Coyote in a way that would make him excited to go out away from that comfort of the fire, or go away from, if we think of assessment, to go away from the kinds of assessment that we, have had to do for a number of years, or that, that we're faced with now, and thinking, are those assessments really relevant? Are they appropriate? Or are there other ways that we might think about, how we learn and how to demonstrate our learning and our understandings in more culturally appropriate ways? So those are some thoughts that I had. And so I also wondered, now that you've heard the story, you've had a wee bit of, introduction into the, respect and responsibility as a principle. But now think about how those principles can help you get ready to engage with students in ways that demonstrate your respect for their different and multiple ways of learning and learning to understand, and how you might then think of getting yourself ready then to learn more about students and what has shaped students' perspectives about learning, about math, about culture. And perhaps you might have a thought that you would want to put into the chat about these principles or about the story. And so I open it up too for anyone who might, want to share a thought about the story in relation to, math assessment, or just some other thought you might have about the owl and about Coyote. Yes.
With regards to the story, for me, I related it back to, as you said, the First People's principles of learning. But for me, it was more that idea of that everyone has a different perspective or way of seeing. And then for, when Old Man Coyote was like looking for it, that was for the bone needle, that was his way of seeing, where the owl had a different perspective because it could fly around and from above, so it saw something else. So just being cognizant of that we all see things differently, and we all have different backgrounds and where we come from. So my perspectives will vary. So mine will not be the same as someone else, or my understanding of something may not be the same as someone else's. And as educators, just considering that, especially in math. Yeah.
Great. Yes, thank you. And could you tell us your name?
Sorry, it's Tatiana.
Oh, Tatiana, thanks very much. Yes, so we can learn to respect our gifts that we have for learning. Old Man Coyote was probably really good at, looking at something that's very close to him in that way. And then, as you say, with the owl, have a different perspective, but together, they might want to then kind of pool their strengths of what's close and seeing what's a little further away.
Mm-hmm. Joanne, there's a couple of comments in the chat.
Yes, thanks. I see Sandra. Do you want to say a little bit more, Sandra?
Sure. Yeah, when you were telling the story, Joanne, and with Coyote looking for, staying close to where he was to look for the owl, and just sort of repeatedly looking there and trying the same method to find this, even though it was elsewhere. Just thinking, like, when we rely on the same assessment methods over and over again, we might not be uncovering what the students know and understand. And then that responsibility to look elsewhere and try different methods is like when Coyote needs to go a little further afield to just find the needle again.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And we have some other comments others could look at too, from Andy and also from Monica and Janice. So thank you for adding some other perspectives, and please keep adding your ideas into the chat. And I think we will need to move along now to Janice Novakowski.
Thank you. So I'm going to tell a story, not the same as Joanne's, not the same type of story, but quite a personal story about my youngest son. As I've been thinking about these principles of respect and responsibility, and this idea that as educators, we have respect for the children that we learn and teach with, but we also have respect for ideas and curriculum, though we have to juggle all of those sort of parameters within our job. And then also that really important relationship that I think, is those culturally responsive principles about connecting to family and culture and community, and not neglecting those, that valuing and making sure that those are an important part of our role. And then that idea that we do have responsibilities, and I think it was Andy that mentioned that in the chat, we can do assessments, whether they're formal or informal, but we have a responsibility to use them in a respectful, responsible way. And that's not for data purposes, for our own purposes. It's to support student understanding and growth, and thinking about the roles that educators and family members and administrators and students all play in that learning relationship is what I've been thinking about, and sort of is embedded in the story that I'm going to share. I just want to preface this. My youngest son is now 23. And the story is from when he was in grade 5, and I checked with him yesterday to make sure that it continues to be okay for me to share this story, especially since this webinar is being recorded. He said, yes, please, if teachers and students can learn from this story, he would like it out in the world. So my youngest son brought many strengths and gifts to school, but struggled in many ways with writing and getting his ideas down on paper. And as many of us know, that is often how children are assessed in our K-12 system, is things only count if they're written down on paper. And that was always really hard for him. And in grade 5, he was formally diagnosed with a learning disability. But his teachers all along the way had recognized that he had these other strengths. And then how can we use what we know about learning and assessment to give my son opportunities to still show what he knows. And so one of the examples from his grade 5 teacher was often when other students were writing a little quiz or had a short sort of formative assessment assignment, instead of calling my son writing things down, the teacher would just say, hey, come on over to my desk and let's just chat about this. And, had that conversation with him as a way for my son to have the opportunity to share his understanding of whatever concepts were being assessed at the time. And it really, that came out of conversations that we had as a family involving my son with the educators at our neighborhood school, and developing this understanding of who he is as a learner and what gifts he brings to the classroom, and how we might all need. And as a parent, for those of you that are parents, that your children teach you so much, but also opening up our thinking as parents and as educators about how to support this learner, being my son, in ways that are going to preserve his dignity and keep his identity as a learner positive. Because as many of you know, at that age, grade 4, grade 5, he was becoming quite socially aware that his written work looked very different than his peers. And he started, saying some things that, hard to listen to as a parent, and you don't want your child diminishing their abilities and competencies. And so finding ways to honor those things, and, to, again, like Joanne has said, to ready ourselves for those different learners that might come across our paths in our classrooms, as an aunt or an uncle, and create those possibilities and opportunities for them to show what they know and can do in different ways. And my son, we were fortunate to work in collaboration, with respect with his educators throughout his elementary and high school years. And he recently just graduated from UBC, with accommodations along the way, and with understanding and compassion for the type of learner that he is. And so, yes, he did have an educator mom that was an advocate for him, but I always just sort of share this story because there's possibility. And there's nothing saying that we have to assess things in certain ways. And so just opening up our thinking about what assessment can be. So that was my personal story there in terms of sharing and making a connection to our role as educators. And then as we think about a sort of a segue into what are those possibilities, what are different types of assessment, I'm going to draw upon an elementary mathematics curriculum example. And as Cynthia talked earlier about learning from the land and what does the land have to offer us, you know, in grade 2 and 3, the learning standards are repeating patterns, increasing and decreasing patterns. And we often do those in classrooms with pattern blocks or Unifix cubes, and students build and describe different patterns. And that's one way to introduce that idea of patterns. But when we also look at some of the competencies in our math curriculum, and for those of you that are not from BC, I've added them here to the slide. We also have these other learning standards that include connecting mathematical ideas to each other and to other areas, incorporate first people worldviews and perspectives to make connections to mathematical concepts. So, you know, one of the things I often do with students is take them outside on math walks or a pattern walk and ask them to think about what math to self, and math to world connections you can make. What patterns are you noticing on the land, in the waters, in the skies around us? What can we learn from the land about patterns and about seasons and cycles and those types of things where you can sort of generalize a pattern or a cycle of some sort? There's a lot of Indigenous knowledge built in local plant species and how they're identified, stories that go along with them, like the little mice story and the fir cones and the little, you know, the hind legs and the tail sticking out of the fir cones. So finding stories and Indigenous knowledge and uses of medicines as ways to connect to those patterns in different leaves and plant growth is one way to connect to the land. And then another way is using, and someone mentioned this earlier in the chat, or I think in Cynthia's quote from the Padlet, is that the land provides us with these materials already to make and create and connect through mathematics to the land. And so here's some grade 2 and 3 students after a windstorm here locally, you know, finding natural materials on the ground to make and create math with, and to think about repeating patterns and increasing patterns by creating and collaborating around a radiating pattern. And then as a teacher, how do you reflect on, well, how am I going to assess this? I'm not going to have anything written down. Well, I always have a phone or an iPad with me, and I took photos. Sometimes I have a clipboard and I might sketch things. I might note down what students are saying and doing, and that's my documentation. It might be through observation or a conversation I have with them. But I think the important message here is that this type of mathematics is demonstrating mathematical understanding in the same way it is as building with Unifix cubes or drawing a picture of a pattern and labeling it. It doesn't have to be written down to count. It doesn't have to be in the classroom to count. There's all sorts of authentic ways to assess students' understanding of mathematical concepts out on the land or outdoors. That's it for me. Wondering if anyone has any questions just before we segue to the next section here about assessing or creating learning experiences outdoors that connect specifically to mathematics.
I just wanted to add to that. I teach outdoor ed at our school, and so I just have little like laminated pieces of paper and a whiteboard marker with me. And so if they make patterns or do nature art or something, I just write their name and take a picture so that later on I know what student did each item, and it's super easy. Yeah.
That's a lovely connection. I know some teachers, I have a studio wagon that I take outdoors, and some teachers have class names on rocks. So there's a little rock with everyone's name, you know, with a paint pen or something, and they can do the same thing. They can take that rock and put it beside what they've created or made in terms of documenting student learning outdoors. And thank you for twigging my memory about that. The little Rains notebooks, if you're not familiar with the Rains notebooks, I use those all the time too. They're waterproof paper, so they're great for taking outdoors for documenting, as well as for students writing as well. You can buy Rains notepads, you can buy Rains brand index cards that are waterproof. Those are new. I just saw them at the Learnery on East Hastings in Vancouver the other day. So lots of different ways, you know, don't let the rain or the weather or the snow deter you. There's lots of different ways to document and engage with learning outdoors.
There's a question in the chat. Can you provide examples of outdoor activities for higher grade levels? Wow, Olivia, you're reading our minds for the next part of this session. But before we go there, does anybody have any other questions or comments you would like to add in thinking about it at the elementary level? And the question around thinking about it at the secondary level is a good one, because we often think that it's much easier to do some of this work with young ones or kindergarten to grade 7. So we will be able to talk about an example at the secondary level as well. Oh, we have another. Kylie has a comment there. Janice, is there a piece of that you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, I see that, and as an educator parent, it's always very difficult to negotiate these conversations. But I think we need to advocate for our children and know that the impact that will have on other people's children as well and other learners. And, sometimes it needs to be a broader conversation beyond just the classroom teacher. If you feel that you're not making any sort of headway with that to support your child, you can invite in other learning resource teacher or an administrator in, because there's nowhere in the curriculum that says that the learning has to be assessed in a certain way. So other than those significant assessments we have at a provincial level, a classroom assessment is meant to be varied, and our new reporting order is very clear about that, that we're looking at multiple forms of assessing student learning.
Mm-hmm. So written is just one.
Yeah.
One. So oral conversation, having a chat with a student, being able to observe, taking those photos that others were mentioning there.
And it doesn't all have to happen on the same day and time. Some students can be, if they want to show you something one day that that they're able to multiply 2-digit by 2-digit numbers, and you create some record of that, and then another student demonstrates that learning another day. Assessment doesn't just happen on certain days and at certain times. It's ongoing, and it's iterative, and there need to be multiple opportunities for students to show what they know over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one other good point before we move on to the next part here is thinking about more areas in schools where there's limited access to thinking about being outside. Would you like to respond to that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm from Richmond, and I know that I'm just looking at who this is. I'm trying to see who. Oh, it's Heidi. We have lots of urban areas in our district and schools that don't necessarily have, forests or creeks in the back. They may have some trees and a bit of grass, but, there's the sky, and you always look up and look at, seasonal patterns in terms of clouds and movement, and can look at weather. We can look at, like Cynthia said, the cracks in the concrete. Moss always finds a way to grow in different places. And I remember, in a school in Vancouver, looking at moss and lichen in different places. And I think it's also, I think about a grade 6 class I worked with, and we did an angle walk, and we took angle finders outside, and we looked at angles, not just in natural things like trees, and plants and leaves, but also in structures and human-made structures and signs. And, they thought about where angles are in all the different places in the world around them. So you don't always have to have a forest or a beach. It's just sort of being outside in community and connecting to your neighborhood. I think is really important too, that learning doesn't just happen between 11 and 12 o'clock during math block, that it can happen in lots of different places and in different ways.
Great, thank you, Janice. Okay, let's move to thinking about some of these ideas in the context of secondary school. Stephanie.
Hello, so my name is Stephanie. I actually come from a secondary background in Alberta, so I'll just start with sort of how I've been processing how to move towards culturally responsive assessment. And so from the program of studies in Alberta, we have that students will be able to multiply fractions concretely, pictorially, and symbolically. And initially, my interpretation of this learning outcome was rather defined by the textbook we used and the resources that were given to me by previous teachers. And so this is these are the interpretations that were ingrained in me. And so pictorially would mean that you have a model. Symbolically would mean that you're working with the numbers and you're teaching the algorithm, and concretely, perhaps you'd give some word problem that or activity that would engage students in trying to understand what multiplying fractions mean. And the trouble with these three, all three of them are quite abstract. They're independent of any lived experience context. They can all be done exclusively in a classroom, independent of any locale. They're independent of any student that's in your room. It'd be the same every year. And there's only one interpretation for each method. So this is what I thought it meant, and I was coming to understand that, it's quite problematic. And so I thought to myself, could I interpret this learning outcome differently? And so in this next one, in order to make it the BC context, I found I don't want to say equivalent, but the corresponding standard in the BC standards. It says students are expected to know operations with fractions, and then in parentheses, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and order of operations. And they go on in the elaborations to include things like Cuisenaire rods, working with models, working with drumming. And so they elaborate on a few different activities or actions you could do that could be considered pictorial, concrete, and symbolic. And so I asked myself, what could this mean if I weren't to impose my own interpretation onto it? And for me, trying to come to that is, well, where do I see multiplication in the lived experience, either my own lived experience or the lived experience of students? What models could students create that give them understanding of the concept? Because that's the purpose of a mathematical model, is to make sense of a concept. And if that model has so many elements to it that need to be taught and understood before the model is helpful, then it's probably not a good model to use. So if students were to come up with their own models, that would be a great way to open it up and sort of defer to student knowledge. And then the next question, where did multiplication of fractions come from? What's the story there? Why did mathematicians engage in that? Like, why was it important that, or what was the inspiration or the initial curiosity that sparked that? The story behind where these abstract concepts came from and why they're important. And then where do we see multiplications of fractions in the world? So that goes back to what I had initially said. And these questions I use kind of as guiding questions because there's a lot of reverence involved. Like, we have to defer to students' understandings and sort of trust that we are not the source of expertise, that students come to us with multiple lived experiences, multiple contexts. Maybe they're talking about math models at home. Like, I know that's probably unusual, but perhaps, right? And imagine the multitude of different models or different understanding or methods for multiplying fractions that could come from, a conversation around the dinner table. Again, I realize that's unusual, but if it came to the classroom, like, if we're opening it up to reinterpretation, we're opening up opportunities to see all of the different ways of understanding and doing multiplication of fractions. And so for me, I know that this multiplication of fraction is a really difficult one. So I was like, oh, if I'm starting from the learning outcome, that's a bit tough. How do I just ask myself, where do I see multiplication? So I thought, all right, I'll start with context. And so if I start from a context, a lived experience, a common issue, perhaps like a global or local issue, or perhaps art, music, dance, something relatable, something lived. And I ask myself, where's the mathematics in that? What math could emerge from that context? And then from there, once I've teased out all the mathematics that might emerge in that particular context, I ask myself, okay, what prompts in a task or in an assessment activity could I use to get students to communicate and engage with those concepts? And it's not to say that you have to know all of the previous, it's not that you have to know all of the math that will emerge. It's just sort of trying to anticipate what prompts you might use, but if mathematics emerges that you didn't expect, to also follow that path. And so you're really decomposing a context to try to identify where the curricular standards might be relevant. And in this, we are sort of, there's more, in my mind, there's more responsibility here, not only to engage in a multitude of understanding of mathematics, but also to, you know, respect student voices. And there's the reciprocity of like back and forth throughout the context, looking for mathematical content. And so there are a lot of possibilities here. Now, I will mention there may be some restrictions. So for example, would this mean that you have to reimagine what your gradebook or your logging system looks like? Probably. Would it require deep reflection? Yes. It would require you to defer to your students more, and that can be kind of uncomfortable sometimes, but it's a process, right? We are opening ourselves up to receive the learning that our students have and can communicate to us. And so this diagram is sort of where I'm starting from, but I'm going to give a specific example now. Let's say my context is gardening. So I think to myself, okay, what's involved in gardening? Perhaps food literacy, or perhaps designing a garden, plant compatibility and yield, the structures in the garden. These are all sort of vague ideas that are connected to gardening. And then I ask myself, okay, what mathematical content lives there? So perhaps measurement, like if I were building a garden bed, I would need to know how to measure, or area and perimeter. Pythagorean theorem exists there, right? If you want garden beds that have a right angle, we'd need to know that. Circle properties might be there if you're looking at circular gardens. Fractions could be there if you're looking at trying to find, if you're working with area models, you may have to work with fractions, because it's doubtful that the garden would be exactly 2 meters by 4 meters. You may have 2.5 meters by 3 3/4 meters, who knows? And so here, what we might engage in is, okay, we're going to design a garden, and we need to know where we want our beds to be, and we know what the general area that we have in order to build that garden. And a possible student response to that activity, and I say possible because we can never predict, of course. When we're not working with prescription, we can't predict. Students, let's say students wanted to have 3 garden beds. They've decided on this. They've decided that they want the rectangular garden beds, and they know the width of the garden, and they realized that they needed space to walk between them. Initially, they had put these beds side by side, and they're like, oh, there's nowhere to walk now. So then they go, okay, well, we have to adjust our measurements. And let's say that they adjust their measurements to figure out what a comfortable walking distance or aisle would be in the garden, and how they might have to change their measurements of the garden beds. And then what fraction of that walking space, what fraction would be walking space? So this is quite speculative, I know, but it is kind of a starting place for thinking about what it means to reimagine what the standards mean in general, and what they could mean other than what those common resources that we come across show us. And I think—
Thank you, Stephanie. Are you, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, I was, yeah, I was just, it is a practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a practice, and it's going to take, as you mentioned, there's maybe some reconceptualizing, rethinking, some imagining of what's possible. And I like your questions there, that maybe what we could ask people to do also is think about a context, think about starting on the land or in a place, and designing some kind of a lesson or activity that could be grounded there. And then think about what would be some assessment practices that could be designed that would following and being guided by the Indigenous Storywork principles would support that. So thinking about reciprocity and reverence and respect and responsibility. And that just takes me to the Padlet just one more time before we end. And we're going to have just a poll that Kelvin, the Edith Lando group, will put up on our screen here so that we can just get a sense of how what everybody thinks of our session, of this session. And as we're doing that, I just wanted to show you the Padlet again. We'll have two areas here, one of stories of respect and stories of responsibility that you can add to, just as we did for over here on reverence and reciprocity. So we hope between now and February, when we meet again, you'll be able to share, or you'll have something that you can post here if you like, or we can talk about it when you join us next session, when we're going to put all of this together and think about it even a little bit further for us on February. Let's see when it exactly is. February just in the way, February 22nd. Is our next session 3, and that will be where we'll kind of pull all of this together and hopefully answer any further questions you might have. If you have some more thoughts that you'd like us to focus on, or questions that have sparked some curiosity for you, please stick those in the chat, and we'll see how we can maybe address those in our 3rd session. So thank you everybody for joining us. Oh, we have 2 minutes. Sorry, I'm ending before our time. If anybody has any questions or thoughts or anything you'd like to share before we wrap up. Oh, Stephanie, you're going to share the resources. Did you want to say something about that at the Padlet?
I could just point out just one.
Okay.
On the Padlet, under resources, if you scroll down, one of them says abstracts of reading/watching resources. This one has little descriptions for the same resources that were listed in the first one. And it's organized by videos. All of the videos are accessible open source. Then there's some open source reading. And then the final one is if you have access to a library, there's some resources there that you could access. But this document has little descriptions for every single resource. So if you don't have a ton of time and you just want to scan, what is this about? You can do that from this document.
Great, thank you. And these are the resources that were posted in our first session up here. So these ones, right? That's what you're referring to? The image of these, yeah. And then so all the references are here. So lots of resources there. And if you have resources that work for you, stick those in the chat. Maybe we can add these, or you can add them to the Padlet yourself by just picking this little plus sign here and just uploading it to the Padlet so that we can have everybody contributing to our knowledge on this. Okay, so now we're at 4:45. So I want to thank everybody again for attending at the end of your busy day. If you're on this side of the world in Pacific time, thank you very much for participating and asking your good questions and making comments. And hopefully this recording will be available to you probably about a week from now. A link will be sent to you, so you'll be able to listen to it again if you so desired, or pass it on to others. And we'll be able to hopefully see you again in February. So thank you, everybody. Happy assessing. Think about those 4 principles, add to the Padlet, and we'll see you in a month. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone, for your participation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So, bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a good.
Hello, everyone. Since it is now the official end of the workshop session, I am going to end the recording.